Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth lecture of the Understanding India series under Paraspar, organized by the Office of Communications, Indian Institute of Science. Today we have Dr. Debjani Banerjee, who will be speaking on a very pertinent topic, Whither the Nation, the relevance of Tagore's ideas in our times. To give you a brief introduction of our speaker today, Dr. Debjani Banerjee teaches humanities at New Jersey Institute of Technology. She holds a PhD from Stony Brook University, New York, and researches in Indian South Asian film and fiction. She has taught English literature, writing, communication, and creative writing at various places, including Srishti Institute of Art, Design, and Technology, Bangalore, Rutgers University, and IISc Bangalore. Banerjee has translated several books, including The Nectar of Life, quotations from the prose writings of Rabindranath Tagore from Bengali into English, as well as The Penguin Guide to Ramayana and The Penguin Guide to Mahabharata. Her earlier articles focus on contemporary writers and filmmakers, including Meera Nair, Chitra Banerjee, Diva Karuni, and Anita Desai. Her recent scholarly publications include And Kabir Stands in the Marketplace, Politics and Poetics in an Era of Global Strife, in Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics, Autumn 2020. The Late Historiography in Contemporary Bollywood Cinema in the Routledge publication, Caste and South Asian Cinema, which is forthcoming in November 2021. From Cheap Labor to Overlooked Citizen, looking for British Muslim identities in Kamila Sami's fiction. South Asia Review, September 2020. Her forthcoming talk at the European Association of South Asian Studies centers around literature in the conflict zones, especially in Kashmir and Sri Lanka, where she explores the radical potential of literature in a world increasingly torn asunder by partisan identities. When she's not reading, she likes to relax with playing with her dogs. So that is a brief introduction of our speaker today. We welcome you, Debjani, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Bethesda. And good morning and good evening, everyone.
Debjani, just one small announcement I want to make.
Sure.
May I request all the attendees to please switch off their mics and their videos so that there is no disturbance during the lecture. Thank you so much. Yes, Debjani, please continue.
Okay, good morning and good evening, everyone. Depending on where you are, please do mute yourselves, and then we can, at the end of the talk, have a good question and answer session. My talk today is titled Whither Nation, the Relevance of Tagore in Our Times. One small observation that I start with is that if Tagore was living today, he would probably be branded anti-national because he was trying so hard to reconcile his disavowal of nationalism with an unequivocal attachment to his country of origin, which really wasn't even a country at the time, just an incipient idea of a nation. The premise of this talk is that late 20th century and early 21st century, we have seen a insidious turn of events in the way that nationalism is used as doublespeak for authoritarian states across the world. The objectives of this talk is to raise questions about the way in which nationalism in Tagore's work can be viewed and revisited, to construct a systematic understanding of nationalism in Tagore's fiction, and gesture towards an alternate mode of belonging. So it's pretty ambitious. I might have to rush through some parts of the talk. I'm going to do this. I'm going to set up the systematic understanding through an analysis of two of the fictional works of Tagore. One is Home and the World, which is known as Ghare Baire, and Gora. And for most of this, I'm going to work against the notion of Tagore as a mystic poet who was very removed from political and everyday realities, or Tagore as a cosmopolitan subject who traveled to different places and had a lot of friends in the Western Hemisphere. So these two posters of one of the book and one of the film, Home and the World, don't really tell you about the very different reception histories of the two. Home and the World, which was written and serialized through 1915 and 1916, has been much more popular. It's been taught across the world. It's being taught across the world. It's more systematic and patterned in its structure, so easier to use in a sense. Gora, on the other hand, is a very complex text, hasn't been translated too much. Home and the World, of course, most famously has been made into a film by Satyajit Ray. And then again, more recently, a Bengali film by Aparna Sen. And as you can see from the poster here, it's been dubbed into other languages as well. We are going to start with the discussion of Home and the World, although that's the latter novel. And Gora is the earlier novel, but you'll understand at the end of the talk why I've done that. The historical context of Home and the World was the larger anti-colonial movement that was going on in India at that time. But also, and this is not talked about much, World War I, which Hemingway had said produced a lost generation in Europe, had also caused much disenchantment in Tagore. And all of that comes out in this work of fiction. More immediately, it was the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, 1905 to 1907, that was brought on by the partition of Bengal. Much before even 1905, the British administrators, the colonial administrators, had been thinking of ways to manage the unruly province of Bengal and ways in which it could be silenced. So they thought the partition was a good idea. But the response to it and the opposition to it was very strong. Tagore himself was very closely involved. And finally, they had to actually repeal it. Movement was led by Bengali intelligentsia. That's a point Tagore makes in this fiction, so it's important to remember. But it's after some of the violence that he witnessed during the Swadeshi movement in 1907, the Kumilla riots, for instance, in particular, that he really turned away not just from Swadeshi, but the whole anti-colonial movement as a whole. Violence was something like Gandhi that Tagore had a lot of difficulty overcoming. Like he couldn't justify that in any way. So he was deeply scarred by it, and Home and the World really comes out of that anguish where he sees human values compromised and killing normalized. So Home and World, the mode of narration is mostly, the novel is divided into sections depending upon the narrator. And it stages several dialogues amongst the various characters. Nikhilesh, who's probably the closest to Tagore's conscience, Sandeep and Bimala. And they constantly argue, debate, and challenge each other's positions. Now, everything that he says here, Tagore has also talked about in his lectures, or they are there in his letters. But I chose this work of fiction because it makes for a fleshing out of views around nationalism, imperialism, their proximities, their differences, and their subtle nuances, really. And Tagore, being a good writer, is able to, even when he's writing up the character of Sandeep, the anti-hero, is able to give that a lot of authenticity. So you actually engage, you're invited to engage with views that are your own and then not your own. All of the main characters have foils, so that there's somebody who's constantly interrogating each of the characters' choices and decisions. The novel begins with Bimala narrating her experiences. It's kind of not a way in, she's not revisiting it, but she's trying to make sense of her experience by sharing her life with the reader. She confides to the reader that she is the beloved of Nikhilesh, a blessing that is not always available to all the Ranis of her family. She's been married well, despite the fact that she is not traditionally beautiful, but her husband Nikhilesh loves her very much. She's also the beneficiary of education. She's well read. And there is Miss Gilby, who comes to teach her both English language and music, and also helps her with her grooming experiences. This is one quote from Bimala. My sight and my mind, my hopes and my desires became red with the passions of this new age. So this is Bimala stepping into the Swadeshi movement. Even before Sandeep arrives on the scene, she is excited by this movement going on outside the home in the world. Though up to this time, the walls of the home, which was ultimate world to my mind, remained unbroken, yet I stood looking over into the distance, and I heard a voice from the far horizon, whose meaning was not perfectly clear to me, but whose call went straight to my heart. So she's already thinking about this movement before Sandeep comes into the stream of events. And then with the encouragement of Nikhilesh, she modifies the normal symbolic order and steps out of the home. This is not seen as a transgression, but a reform of tradition. And Nikhilesh is allowed to do things like that because he is the darling of the grandmother, and so he can break traditions and set up new ones. And it is at this point that Sandeep comes to visit their estate, Sukshire, and she is even more carried away with the patriotic zeal. Her first conflict with her husband is about their teacher, Miss Gilby, who is Anglo-Indian or British, and she gets hit. She gets hurt by some of the boys throwing a stone at her, and Bimala is very, very quick to dismiss her and asks Nikhilesh that can we just, tell her to leave? And Nikhilesh is very shocked. I cannot, my husband said, look upon Miss Gilby through a mist of abstraction just because she is English. Cannot you get over the barrier of her name after such a long acquaintance? Cannot you realize that she loves you? So this is the first kind of conflict that they have over Swadeshi. Nikhilesh is not so easily swept away by the movement that is going on in the world. He can be seen, he's the head of a patriarchal extended family at the center of kinship ties. But his understanding of the nation is also based on Western discourses and local enterprise. So Bimala tells us that he is a tireless entrepreneur. He manufactures soap, is engaged in a number of business ventures, shipping and transportation, which is actually Tagore takes that from the life of his brother, Jyotirindra Tagore, who was constantly involved in a lot of local entrepreneurial projects, and most of them not really successful. This is a quote from Nikhilesh that's important and that kind of explains what I had called Tagore's earlier pull, his disavowal of nationalism, and yet his unequivocal attachment to the land. For the matter of that, I have become unpopular with all my countrymen because I have not joined them in their carousels. They're certain that either I have a longing for some title or else that I'm afraid of the police. The police on their side suspect me of harboring some hidden design and protesting too much in my mildness. So that's him. Sandeep is, of course, the charismatic, powerful anti-hero. He has a huge personality. He's very articulate, almost to the point of being a demagogue. He believes in using force and violence for the greater cause of Swadeshi. He chants Vande Mataram. And in today's world, definitely Sandeep would be seen as a populist authoritarian leader. I'll talk more about authoritarian leaders in a bit. I'm going to share a clip with you. Let's see if this works.
স্বদেশী চলে যাক, আপনার সঙ্গে বসে গল্প করে বাকি জীবনটা কাটিয়ে দিই।
আমার সঙ্গে গল্প করে
আপত্তি আছে? হাসছেন যে?
এত বাড়ি বলে কার না হাসি পায় বলুন? আপনি 1 ঘন্টাও একটানা বসে গল্প করার লোক নন।
ঠিকই বলেছেন। আসলে আমার স্বদেশীও চাই, আপনাকেও চাই।
আমি কিন্তু চাই না আপনারা দেশের কাজ বন্ধ করেন। এ ব্যাপারে আমার স্বামীর সঙ্গে আমার মোটেই মতে মেলে না। ওর অনেক গুণ আছে, সেখানে আমি তাকে শ্রদ্ধাও করি, কিন্তু উনি মানুষটা অত্যন্ত বেশি রকম ঠান্ডা। আমার মনে হয় না দেশের এই অবস্থা এতটা ঠান্ডা হলে চলে।
আমি আপনার সঙ্গে সম্পূর্ণ একমত।
আমার স্বামী বলছিলেন আপনারা গরিবদের কথা ভাবেন না, তাই আপনাদের দিয়ে দেশের কোনো উপকার হবে না। কিন্তু আমি বিশ্বাস করি না আপনারা গরিবদের উপর কোনো অত্যাচার করবেন। শুধু বুঝিয়ে বলে যেটুকু হয় সেটুকুই করবেন।
মুশকিল কি জানেন মক্ষী? শুধু বুঝিয়ে বললে হয় না, তার উপরেও কিছু লাগে।
কিসের কথা বলছেন আপনি?
সেটা জিজ্ঞেস করবেন না।
আমি জানতে চাই।
বৈষয়িক ব্যাপার নিয়ে আমি আপনার সঙ্গে কথা বলতে চাই না।
কেন?
আমাদের সম্পর্কে সুরটা কেটে যায়, আমি চাই না।
আমি কিন্তু আপনাকে সাহায্য করতে পারলে খুশি হব।
এটা আপনার সাধ্যের বাইরে।
আমাকে অসাধ্য সাধন করতে দেখেননি আপনি?
আপনার সাধ্য অনেক দূর, এটা মেনে নিয়ে বলছি। আপনি এ ব্যাপারে আর প্রশ্ন করবেন না, আমার অনুরোধ।
তাহলে তো আমার আর এখানে থাকার কোনো প্রয়োজন নেই। আমি আসি।
মক্ষী, এভাবে রাগ করে চলে যাও না মক্ষী।
আপনার স্বদেশী কাজে যদি আমার কোনো প্রয়োজন না থাকে, তাহলে তো আমার এখানে থাকার আর কোনো মানেই হয় না।
আমি তোমাকে অযথা দুশ্চিন্তায় ফেলতে চাইনি মক্ষী। রাজনীতির বাইরে কি আমাদের কোনো সম্পর্ক নেই? কাজের কথা ছাড়া কোনো কথা নেই?
আপনি কথা দিন, আপনার যদি টাকা লাগে আপনি তা আমাকে বলবেন, আর সে টাকা যদি আমি আপনাকে এনে দিই আপনি তা নেবেন।
দিচ্ছি কথা মক্ষী, দিচ্ছি কথা। মক্ষী, আমি সন্ধ্যাবেলা আসবো, তুমি এ ঘরে থাকবে। রোজ রোজ লোক পাঠিয়ে রাখতে ভালো লাগে না।
হাতটা ছাড়ুন।
তুমি
That can help you understand the way the relationship is going. Obviously, Bimala is very infatuated, not just by the Swadeshi cause, but by also what Sandeep as a man has to offer. After this, things will go downhill between them, and much of the later part of the plot is about Bimala understanding who Sandeep is really, and the fact that his intentions for the country is not exactly what she thought earlier they were. So he's definitely shown as a very charismatic character, but his commitment to the nation is, let's say, compromised at every step. And Sandeep tries to sort of set Bimala up as deify her as the mother goddess and as a symbol of the nation, but that also unravels quickly. She wants to give her jewelry for the cause, and of course he is very happy to take it, but then there are a lot of plot complications. It's Sandeep's limited moral compass along with his very strong personality that creates for all the conflict in the novel. When he realizes that the villagers in Nikhilesh's estate will not give up foreign-made goods in favor of Swadeshi alternatives, he decides to change his tactics, and his acolytes, the young students who are following him, the revolutionaries, he sort of urges them on to loot British goods from traders in the village and burn them. and of course all the time chanting Vande Mataram. And then if they don't obey, then they're going to further burn their granaries and their sources of income, basically. And of course, Nikhilesh does not want that to happen in his estates. He doesn't think that boycotting foreign goods is a good idea because it deprives poor peasants of their livelihood. And that's where the conflict happens between them. The trail of violence continues. There are communal riots. Nikhil goes to intervene and is caught in the crossfire. In Tagore's novel, Nikhilesh doesn't die at the end. It's left kind of unclear. But his attempt at working with the peasants, the goal of constructive Swadeshi, is an objective that was close to Tagore's heart. That's something that he also took on. And Sandeep's indifference to the downtrodden and the dispossessed peasantry provides the tragic consequences of the novel. One of the often it has been alleged that Tagore was trying to write about Gandhi in the character of Sandeep, and that's really difficult to imagine just in terms of timelines, because Gandhi came to India only at the beginning of 1915, and it took him a couple more years to settle down. But more importantly, Tagore and Gandhi were friends. There's this like huge number of letters that they've exchanged, and there were more similarities between them than differences. One of the similarities I've said is about their attitude to violence. A difference between them is about the way they viewed Western civilization. I don't know if you know this. Once Gandhi was asked, what do you think of Western civilization? And he responded, oh, that would be a good idea. So, but Tagore, and even in his, worst jokes, would not be able to say something like that. He was very, very respectful of Western civilization and the values that it could provide, while all the time being very, very wary of imperialism. He clearly understood that if Western civilization came together with imperialism, then both had to be discarded. But he did see a lot of value in Western civilization, and this was an important difference between the two of them. Sandeep is not really Gandhi. He's closer to a Nietzschean Superman, and here too you can see Tagore being very prescient, not just about nationalism, but also looking at the 20th century as producing a lot of people, a lot of individuals who were anthropocentric and who believed that they could take anything that belonged to them. There's no question of sharing the world with other creatures. Sandeep was also very spellbinding orator, and he had no respect for the masses or the people. Comparing masses to horses has led to him being compared to autocratic leaders. We'll talk more about autocratic leaders later in a few minutes. But what I want all of you to take away from this is that while Nikhilesh's way is seen as one that he couldn't eventually institute or eventually gets demolished in the course of the novel, but it just speaks of a path of difficulty and not of impossibility. So that's his brand of nationalism, which is more thought out and more connected with local community and local workers, and people who are different in caste, class, and religion. His nationalism embraces them all, and that's an important thing to remember. Other than that, Tagore was also completely able to see how nationalism was being used as a term for pretty much anything anybody wanted to get done. A Japanese writer who had asked Tagore for moral support for Japan's invasion of China in the name of saving China for Asia, and Tagore criticizes that. I was amused to read the recent statement of a Tokyo politician that the military alliance of Japan with Italy and Germany was made for highly spiritual and moral reasons and had no materialistic considerations behind it. Quite so. What is not so amusing is that Noguchi thinks I should echo such remarkable sentiments that translate military swagger into spiritual bravado. So this is important because at that time, especially in the 1930s, there were a lot of other leaders, other contemporary stalwarts of the anti-national movement in India who could not see through this, who often were very mesmerized by the kind of strong-arm nationalism that was going on in Germany and Italy. And Tagore was one of the few people who could actually completely see through that nationalism as being very close to fascism and authoritarianism and therefore being dangerous. And he also saw that the abstraction of nationalism, when chosen over the concreteness of people and communities, was one of its weakest aspects. And somehow people who believed in nationalism would have to find a way of overcoming that. His overall positions on nationalism is that it was a powerful anesthetic, and he felt that before nationalism became instituted or before we became a nation, untouchability and sectarian violence needed to be resolved. And then some of this we see being played out in Gora, which was serialized in 1910 and 1911. Gora is a more complex novel in a sense. And therefore it's not been translated as much. There's one black and white film from 1938, the music of which was done by Qazi Nazrul Islam. But it's a very poor print and it's very hard to go through. There was a Doordarshan adaptation in 2013, which was all right. So the plot and the context of Gora is the character of Gora mostly, but also symmetrical characters spanning two religions, the Hindus and the Brahmo Samaj. So the Brahmo Samaj is a nascent religious order, and Tagore belonged to it. His father was one of the spiritual preceptors and the founders of the Brahmo Samaj. It was like Dayanand Saraswati's Arya Samaj, one of the breakaway reformist groups from Hinduism, and the novel Gora kind of plays out conflicts between the two. Both Brahmo Samaj and Hinduism have their very bigoted zealots, and Tagore criticizes both. He calls out blind religious belief whenever it's in excess and whenever it's used to exclude other people or create divisiveness. He calls it out, as in Gora. The character of Gora is again very interesting. It's a Bildungsroman, so Gora is going to change at the end of the novel, but in the beginning he's an impassioned character, very much like Othello, very splendid declamatory speeches, very patriotic. He's an Orthodox Brahmin. He will not even eat his mother's cooking because she doesn't practice untouchability and her maid Lakshmi happens to be Christian. He's also a committed nationalist, but very, very firm and fixed in his views about orthodoxy and untouchability. And after that, there are an array of characters who take this forward. There's Gora's father, who's another orthodox character. There's his mother, who doesn't practice untouchability, Anandamoyi. And there is his friend Binoy, who is attracted to someone in the Brahmo Samaj, and her name is Lalita. So these romantic entanglements are really what take the story forward. Gora is also very close to Sucharita. They are good friends, but because she is of the Brahmo Samaj and he is of the Orthodox Hindu, he doesn't think that they can get married. He's not going to change his religious beliefs or sacrifice them, even though Sucharita is willing to convert. There's Lalita's father, Paresh Babu, who plays a very, like Gora's mother, is a more tolerant character. And there is Sucharita's suitor, who is again a very bigoted Brahmo Samaj member. Here also we see Tagore criticizing people of his own religious order, and that's also unusual because at this time, especially if it was a nascent religion like Brahmo Samaj, you would try to be very protective of it and not criticize it, but he does, he calls it out when it doesn't lend itself to generosity particularly. So there are a number of quotes from Gora, and where he's trying to talk about the real country. And when Sucharita asks why Gora's country is connected to a faith, his response is, "Our faith is our history. This is what our country has always had. For India, that faith is Hinduism. That alone can make our country one." So of course, the irony resonates, and Gora's complete inability to see diversity around him, and he cannot see members of other religions, or other castes around him. And of course, those of you who've read Gora know what's going to happen to him. He's going to find out a terrible truth, which is that he's not even a Hindu. He was an orphaned Irish Christian whose father had been killed in the Sepoy Mutiny and whose mother gave birth to him and died, and Anandamoy decided to adopt him. The truth is revealed to him by his father, who is very ill and thinks that if he dies, he's very afraid that Gora, who's not really a Hindu, may do his last rites. And he's so frightened at this prospect that he confesses to Gora. And in one fell swoop, Gora is deprived of a past, a religion, and a history. What then happens to his nationalism? So this is important because suddenly, Gora at one moment is like, this country is all about Hinduism, and then suddenly it's not. And he's reborn with this knowledge. He could have been destroyed, but of course he's a fictional character whom Tagore is going to consolidate. So his ability to see differences and diversity, to question his caste-based practices, is emphasized by Tagore. And this is the process of realization when Gora understands that even being a foreigner or alien, he can still love his country. And that's the moment of his epiphany where he tells Sucharita and the more moderate Brahmo Samaji, Paresh Babu, "Can you truly comprehend what I'm saying? What I had always wanted to be but was unable to, today I have become exactly that. I'm an Indian. There is no opposition within me of Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or any other entity. Today, all communities of India are my communities." So, and then this is even more important. There was an emptiness in my mind that I have tried to ignore. That is why I never dared to look at Bharat as she is. I built up a perfect ideal and embellished it. I no longer need to adorn what I love more than my life, and I can begin my real work at last, the welfare of 25 crores of my people. At last, I have become what I have always wanted to, but never could be, an Indian. So this is Gora's epiphany and his renewed understanding of becoming an Indian. Freed of the constraints of birth and of religion, he's able to actually connect to his country. And finally, his love for his country is no longer an ideational thing, but something that he can share with his mother, Binoy, and Sucharita. And in this sense, he's going back to his mother because her idea of the nation was always much more accepting. So what Tagore is trying to point out here through the journey of the character of Gora is that nationalism and religious singularism, when intertwined, really takes focus away from the nation. An individual who connects the faith that they practice with the land that they inhabit can often be exclusionary in practice. And this is what happens to Gora. He's trying to use his religious beliefs to fight back the British imperialists, but what really happens is just increasing bigotry and religious zeal. He also ends up distancing himself from his mother, and so his return to, his mother and to Sucharita and getting back together with them is the kind of happy ending of the novel. This is a point at which I'm going to talk about a lot of work that's being done now on trying and understanding religious nationalism and whether a secularism is even possible or not. And in that context, I'm going to bring up the work of Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi jurisprudent expert, a political theorist who believed that monotheism is the only way that nations can survive. He was a passionate defender of Hitler's regime up until, I think, 1936, and then when he didn't go along with Hitler's eugenic theories, they threw him out. I mean, he could still teach at the college, but he wasn't a member of the party anymore. So here are some big ideas from Schmitt that I want you to, pay attention to and see if we can connect it to the world around us and to these readings that I've just discussed. That there is no such thing as a secular state. Whatever assumes the shape of the political must be driven by passionate religiosity. A secular state is a contradiction in terms, and in that non-secular state, religious minorities can be given considerations but not rights. The power of an authoritarian leader, the sovereign leader, is one who is not shackled by constitutions, laws, and treaties. A truly sovereign president will cut through red tape and take whatever action is necessary. Sounds all very good and efficient, but it's scary when you think of the way the Myanmar government has just, cut through the red tape and decided that the Rohingyas are not going to be, allowed to live in the country anymore. Rise of authoritarianism, Schmitt's third radical idea is to redefine democracy, and he thinks that democracy is not a contest between different political parties, but the creation of an almost mystical connection between leaders and masses. And again, we can look at a lot of authoritarian leaders around us, Turkey, Brazil, and see if that is exactly what's going on, or Hungary. And here is the most dangerous one. Us and them, or self and the other. Schmitt's big idea that politics is fundamentally about the distinction between friends and enemies. Liberal democracies are hypocritical. They have constitutions and laws that pretend to treat everybody equally, but this is a sham. All states are based on distinctions between them and us, between friend and enemy. A nation needs to constantly remind itself of its enemies to ensure its own survival. And often the enemies can be, of course, minorities within the state, and Trump had both when he was president. He had minorities within the state, he had the Mexicans, Muslims, and then he had the Chinese and others outside the state. So this is how a whole group of authoritarian leaders have been using what Schmitt's principles are. Secular principles cannot survive on their own, basing themselves on universals pertaining to human nature. So Schmitt had no faith in human nature. He said it's fallible and it is definitely going to lead to xenophobia, and that human beings are essentially xenophobic. If you read his entire works, that's what you come up with. And those are the texts in which he sums up these ideas. But the point that obviously the question that I want to leave open here is this the only way of looking at human beings and individuals and the kind of state of the world at this moment, through xenophobia and through masses who are easily led by authoritarian leaders? Okay, is this the only way? And Hannah Arendt, who was a Holocaust survivor, not the opposite of Schmitt in a sense, has also said something that's equally concerning, which is the success of totalitarian movements depends upon the masses who are presumed to be indifferent or neutral, but who have acquired the appetite for political organization, held together by a consciousness of common interest. So this is an important point to understand, because what we perceive as state laws and outside of our control is often majoritarian will. So, you know, we need to keep thinking about this, and it's important to read people like Schmidt at this point, because you want to look at the ideological confusions around the terms secularism and democracy, and move on to understand what is it that we want for ourselves or from the world around us. If not nation, what? So Partha Chatterjee has written about the ways in which Tagore's concept of Swadesh makes possible his critique of nation. And again, Chatterjee himself says that the relationship of every individual to Swadesh should be personal and quotidian. So every day, it's about what you do every day. Samaj is a society that is deeply inward-looking, in which education has found its true expression, arts, and music. So this is the kind of, I said at the beginning that I was going to gesture towards what Tagore wanted to do and how he thought he could solve this problem. Schmidt thinks all individuals are wounded, they're fallible, they're incapable of good. Tagore does not think that. But he also doesn't think that all individuals or all human beings are essentially good or that they're born good. But there is a process of mediation, and that mediation happens through education. And that is what, if you look at Tagore's life and his discourses, that is really what he was doing for most of his life. You know, in 1901, he sets up the school in Shantiniketan, right, which is going to be, you know, even from an ecological point of view, it's a school outside and in the groves as much as it's inside. It's informed by scientific way of thinking. Its emphasis is on expression, arts, history, music, dance, and then he sets up Vishwa Bharati in 1918 with ideals of free expression, non-sectarian learning, and then he realizes that, you know, people in the community need to know more about agriculture and rural reconstruction. He sets up Sri Niketan, sends his son Ratindranath to America to study that more closely. And this connection with community and space is for him, for Tagore, the starting point of nationalism. And I'm quoting here from historian Shapna Banerjee's book, Fathers in a Motherland, and she talks about his curriculum combining arts, music, dance, and poetry was geared towards attaining joy and freedom rather than prioritizing physical strength, emotional stoicism, and job skills. So, of course, he's responding to, you know, increased martialization, but also keeping this emphasis on culture is really important because, again, he's ahead of his times. And we know after Foucault has told us this, that the modern nation state carries out imaginative forms of surveillance in cultural rather than coercive ways, right? And Tagore had learned from his observation of Western nation states that culture is the domain where the mind can be controlled. And we see that with Bimala. Repressive institutions and powerful individuals are harmful, but it is the school, home, family where the mind can be shaped in ways that have a profound effect on the community. Tagore, the visionary, was able to see the readings of Gora and Home in the World, which show that the social control of our bodies and mind is important and it is often held elsewhere. Bimala and Gora both learned through plot events that their minds had been held prisoner by seductive rhetoric or blind superstition. And Tagore says, I believe I have outgrown that teaching, and it is my conviction that my countrymen will gain truly their India by fighting that education which teaches them that a country is greater than the ideals of humanity. So that education, remember that he's fighting against English education, and not just the education in the language English, but also the structure, the Western structure of education, which, Edward Said has talked about the same thing, the imperialist epistemologies in Orientalism. So he does set up Vishwa Bharati with promise of a universalist pedagogy, but as everyone knows, it didn't quite come to fruition. And so if we are looking at a call for action, this can be a starting point for us to study the curricular uniqueness of Vishwa Bharati and try to see if there is something that we can take away from it. Can education in the ways Tagore was implementing it help us take a turn from the hyper-nationalism, radicalization, and cultural separatism? And can curriculums mediate this by setting up anti-imperial language structures, but also structures of thought that can fight or contend with the present situation of increased separatism and xenophobia and authoritarian leadership. After 1945, Germans refused to accept the assumptions of a Schmittian world of a society divided into friends and enemies. Instead, they forged a constitution that embedded the rule of law and liberal freedoms. That embrace of liberal democracy was a hard-fought lesson. And now the rise of new authoritarians around the world again is forcing us to learn this. Is it possible to construct through education and curricular content and epistemological frameworks of renewed nationalisms that can fight the pull of the authoritarian? After all, what is at stake is war, statelessness, and death. In his book Necropolitics, Achilles Membe, talking about late 20th century nationalisms, has said that sovereignty now is about the power of nations to decide who gets to live and who dies. And he's given examples across the world. We can see our own examples: Syria, Hungary, Myanmar, etc. And the end game of nationalism, as Tagore well foresaw, was this kind of destruction. It will probably not be out of place to end this talk with remembering Danish Siddiqui, the photographer, and I'm going to take this opportunity to reiterate that no rational refutation is possible of the essential humanist position that killing is wrong. So we want to think about wars and other conflict in the name of the nation. Siddiqui was killed in Afghanistan. Who knows why that war is happening and what's the outcome of that. And I wanted to focus on this picture of the Rohingya woman, the ultimate stateless symbol of the 21st century. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Debjani, for this very insightful lecture. We'll take some questions. Whoever wants to ask a question can raise your hand, or you can type in your question in the message box. I can read out the question. There is a comment. Excellent presentation by Udayan Mitra.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Debjani, for. Am I audible?
Yes,
you are.
Professor Ghosh, you are.
Very insightful presentation. I missed a little bit of it in between due to some technical snag, but I enjoyed it, and I particularly appreciate the last slide where you show the very thoughtful of you showing the photograph taken by Danish Siddiqui. In fact, that's the way to pay tribute to this great soul, I should say. And You're also making mention about Tagore's building of Sriniketan, because this, I think I wanted to tell, and it has emerged from your talk, that his Vishwabharati is a combination of Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, which many of us may not be knowing, and the rural reconstruction movement, which took up at Sriniketan. Particularly, his message was very clear through that first line of the poem of that collection, Prantik, Jabar Shomoy Holo Bihonger. That was exactly on 1934, if I recall correctly, 29th of April, where he says that Jabar Shomoy Holo Bihonger. It's the time for the bird to return to its nest, and then we find his creations like Ora Kaj Kore, Mudhumoy Prithibir Thuli, Bhula Mondir, and all that. This was a very interesting, very important. These two, Dani Siddiqui and rural reconstruction part of Tagore, appealed to me very much in your presentation. And what I'd just like to remark and would like to know your take on it, that when first the poem Bharat Tirtha was published in Bongodarshan Putrika, in fact, it came out with the name Matri Abhishek. Mar Abhishek. At that time, the name was not Bharat Tirtha. And it was perhaps commented by Tagore that it's the poetic gist of my novel Gora. Gora Upannasher Kabbik Nirjas. I'd like to know your take on it. Thank you.
Right. So, yes, I mean, to your earlier comment about Shantiniketan and Sriniketan, yes, this is what, Tagore's day-to-day quotidian nationalism would be in this, in working with communities, making space for that kind of work. And rather than a rhetoric of nationalism and going on saying, your country is so great and things like that, it would be the everyday work that he did. And Sriniketan could not have been, Birbhum could not have been an easy place to try to do agriculture in, right? The soil is not like fertile like the rest of Bengal. So that is also an interesting choice that he made. And as for Bharat Tirtha and Matri Abhishek, yes, I think, Gora's coming back to Anandamoy's way of life is really the essence of that novel. But what's really interesting, if you study Gora and Home and the World together, is that in Gora, he actually sees, he's playing with this idea of mother as symbol of the nation, or at least of a normative order. But in Home and the World, he's clearly canceling that, and he's questioning Sandeep's deification of Bimala as a mother goddess, or he's realized by that time that these notional symbols don't really work except to further oppress those people who are struggling. So I think that also tells us why the name was changed from Matri Abhishek to Bharat Tirtha. Dr. Gora.
Yeah, can we take the other questions now?
Yes.
There are a few comments. I'll just read them out quickly. Rashmi Dash says that erudite talk, thank you. Swapna says thanks. Debjani for perking up the morning with fascinating talk. Many thought-provoking ideas to think through the rest of the day. There are questions, but maybe we'll request Neetu Kapoor to ask her question.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, ma'am, lovely talk by you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that we saw, I think, one clipping of a scene. It was on the displayed on the screen. So I was just wondering whether you could have more clippings, like that, because the more you see such things, you understand things better.
Of course.
Yeah. This is what I wanted to ask you. That if you could,
I will keep that in mind. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. And lovely talk and lovely evening, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, so much.
I'll read a question from the chat box.
Sure.
This is by Vinod S. How relevant are Smith's political view today when the tendency is to go anti-establishment on everything? With Smith during his lifetime was fully aligned to the authority, though a majority of the world was against the authority at the time for a justifiable reason, which echoes even today.
Right. So I think the way Smith's thoughts are relevant today is that while there is some amount of anti-establishment, I think the rise of authoritarian leaders across the world has also brought in this understanding that people more or less feel that if you find a strong leader, or if you can rely on one individual rather than expressing or sort of interrogating your rights as a democratic citizen, rather than getting into your own citizenship rights, rather have a leader who will do all that for you. And that is exactly what Schmitz is saying. And also the rise of religious nationalism across would also echo with Schmidt, who said, that nobody can really, there is no such thing as a community.
Debjani, you got muted.
So yeah, so that his views are relevant just to understand how authoritarianism increases, or maybe to even understand right. Sorry, can you say that again? There's another question, Bitasa. Should I answer that? How would Gora evolve in today's right-wing ideology? So that's why I had brought in Schmidt to understand that, when Gora has his epiphany, he feels almost relieved that he can now focus on the country rather
resilience.
Can I request others to please mute themselves? It's a lot of disturbance.
Okay, so yes, to answer that question, how would somehow I can't read the whole question. See more, yes. How would Agora evolve in today's right-wing dominated political ideology? Yes, exactly. I mean, I think if the whole point is that I'm not accepting this domination as a done deal, I'm seeing that the right wing is trying to dominate, but how can we push back and how can we resist? So yes, education, understanding that orthodoxy is just one way of consolidating the self and excluding the other. And you don't want to consolidate the self and exclude the other because, Sri Lanka, for instance, is one really strong example of what happens when you do not pay attention to minority communities. So I think that's my response.
That was a question from Arindam Basu, and I'm going to read out a question from Dr. S.K. Sinha. It was a wonderful experience listening to you. To me, it would be more pertinent to associate Tagore with spiritual humanism and nothing else. His idea of nationalism is more of a cultural appreciation of those beliefs that support human values of being human. You refound him again in me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So there's another comment from Shilpa Doreswamy. An absolutely delightful session. Thanks for sharing your perspective, Debjani.
Thank you, Shilpa.
Arindam Basu again had posted that question. Okay, can Himadri Lahiri unmute himself and ask the question, please?
Thank you, Debjani, for your nice, long time, right. Wonderful presentation. And I have a small comment or a question rather. You see that in both the representations that you cited, both in Gora and also in Home and the World, you see that there is an element of helplessness in watching that things are getting out of hand. So far as hyper-nationalism is concerned, or religious nationalism concerned. That is one point that is very relevant to me right at the moment, when we see, when we can understand that things are not really good, and we see people, our neighbors, being overwhelmed by ideology that is going to do harm to our country or nation. So would you comment on that? Because this to me is a very important point that may not have been focused much. Thank you, Debjani.
Yes, and let me just make sure I've understood your question. So you want me to comment on the element of helplessness?
Yes.
Okay, and
in watching that some ideologies which you do not support and which can do harm to your nation is going full strength, and you can't control, nobody can control. And this sense of helplessness is also overwhelms us at the present moment.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So that's why I'm finding, calls to action that can we revise curriculum? Can we, set up a way in which we can talk to people around us? Yes, I've noticed and felt, especially in an urban majoritarian milieu, I felt a certain kind of helplessness and an inability to communicate about these harmful ideologies. But I think if we, keep, like, you and I are educationists, Himadri, so we stay focused on education and maybe work around with curriculum. For instance, Tagore's works have just been, have you read that they've just been taken out of the curriculum and been, on another hand, been replaced by more works that are more concomitant with the current ideology of the nation. So those are the kinds of moves that we need to keep resisting and keep working against, and make sure that more of Gora and Home and the World, we can talk about these in our classes.
Right. Thank you.
Is there any last question? So there was a question regarding the recording. I just wanted to inform everyone that we'll upload the recording on Office of Communications YouTube channel, and also on Office of Communications website. So you can access it later. Yeah, maybe with that we can call it a day, Debjani.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bitasa, for inviting me. Thank you to the Office of Communications. And thank you everyone else for joining in today and patiently listening and engaging. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Debjani. It's very, very useful for all of us who have listened to you today. And we hope we'll have more of such, events in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.